And we're live.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Lisa.
Hey, Josh. Hey, everyone. Hope everyone's having a good Wednesday. Welcome to the Dark Ozarks.
Absolutely. We're a week and a half past Beltane, and summer is here.
With a fury.
Yes, yes. Possibly several furies, actually.
Yes, basically 90 degrees.
Mm-hmm. Was it? This is Wednesday. Yeah. Monday night. Monday afternoon. I'm like, you know what? Air conditioning's going on. I have not turned it off since.
Yeah. Same.
Oh, so is what it is. We might still have something resembling springtime in the Ozarks. I don't know, but reading about some of our topic tonight, going back to the 1860s, when somebody in the district commander of Southwest Missouri decided it would be a good idea to wage a winter campaign against Confederate forces in Arkansas. As I was reading that, I'm going, maybe sunny and 92 isn't so bad after all.
That's true. So yeah, I guess be thankful for that.
Yeah.
I guess quick shout out to Always Buying Books,
Yes.
our sponsor, and we appreciate Bob and Elise and everything they do. Great resource for materials or whatever type of reading you're interested in.
Exactly.
Shout out that anyone in the area. Ladies, there's an event May 20th, Girls Night Out, after hours at the store with special sales. No guys, no kids, and no Bob.
But I'm assuming plenty of books.
Plenty of books with special sales. So.
Oh, any ghosts?
Yes, actually, it is haunted.
Okay.
I've investigated it before.
I can't wait to get up there and shoot an episode from the location. And of course, huge shout out to our sponsor for being kind enough to support us in all of this, and fantastic opportunity. You don't have to just be doing research work. You can just be looking for fun. For us, the lines are consistently blurred between fun books and research books. I'm very happy about that.
That's true. And speaking of research, we've had fun this week for getting ready tonight.
Yeah. I've had particular fun today. Nothing like a little procrastination. I was visiting with someone who was saying, what can I say? Kind of wait till the last minute to do stuff. I'm like, I have no room to talk, so I get you, man.
I've been known to.
Arkansas, particularly Arkansas, heavily focused on Arkansas, but also Indian Territory and some borders in relationship to the Civil War, as well as a couple of topics that actually precede the Civil War that, boy, howdy, are they dark.
Yes, they are dark, and actually, you're talking about Cane Hill and the Wright Massacre. Actually, when you think about it, there are quite a few parallels between the events at Cane Hill in 1839 and the Ball Knobbers many years later, and really a lot of similar moving parts. You have political issues. You have this robbery and lawlessness. But it's interesting that in 1837, major Indian removal segment went to Cane Hill, and they were supposed to settle in Cane Hill, and they were pushed further west into Indian Territory because settlers didn't want them there. And there was a fellow there with a post, Mr. Wright, who began trading with the Indians across the border, and he had a considerable amount of money. And so basically a group of men decided to relieve him of his money and kill him and his family and most of his family and burn his house down.
Yes. So, I think it's important to understand, really wrap our heads around the fact that this is a considerable amount of time before the Civil War.
Yeah.
This is 1839. Of course, the Civil War would not happen until 1861. So that gives you, a pretty decent sense of that. One of the things that is just extraordinarily striking to me is the disturbing level of violence that the men who chose to rob the Wright cabin. And I'm going to make a counterpoint on this. There, to compare it with the Eden massacre near Oldfield and Chadwick, which of course was essentially the last ride of the Christian County Bald Knobbers. Making a comparison, there were highly in regards to the Christian County Bald Knobbers, the Walkers in particular, versus the Edens, highly inflamed passions, and generally the sense of mob violence gone wrong, or a mob gone wrong and pushed into violence, and a conflagration occurring that resulted in deaths, resulted in injury. Obviously, there were women and children involved who were injured or nearly injured in the melee, but the Christian, from everything that we have documentation wise at this point, the Walkers and the Christian County Bald Knobbers were not being motivated by profit, and they were not going there with the intent of killing children. No,
although so some of the impetus of the Bald Knobbers in Taney and Christian County were to combat robberies and other crime, lawlessness.
Yes, it was. And interestingly enough, in the Cane Hill Massacre of 1839, there was a vigilante group in place that was functioning to the best of their ability to provide some sense of law and order. And whether they got it right or not is up for grabs, but certainly they were dedicated to their work. The reality of the situation, late evening, Saturday, June 15th of 1839, and William Carter's wife, Frances, hears horses and men outside their cabin. The family begin to wake up, and they inquire, and the men say that they're looking for lodging. It's pretty evident that William Carter Wright was not anticipating violence, because he opens the door and they kill him.
Right. And of course, this was part of his business too, as having a post would be he would take in guests.
Lodgers.
Lodgers.
And again, I think one of the things that we're going to see potentially throughout this episode are these seeming contradictions. We in regards to the war, in regards to the various aspects of the war, and right here we have a man who is surrounded by his family. The Wrights had 9 children. By all evidences, most of them are children or infants. And they're in the wilds of the frontier, at that time. They're actually in a very dangerous place, but as is seemingly contradictory, but not when you understand the pragmatism of the age. Hospitality is part of it. You rely on these things. There isn't a Motel 6 or an Airbnb or a Hampton Inn, and so individuals' homes, particularly individuals who were running businesses that were trading posts, would in all likelihood open up at all hours of the night to give you a place on the floor and possibly a bowl of beans.
Exactly. It
And
happened all the time.
And sometimes just throw several people into bed together.
Exactly.
And that was not an odd thing. So I think in that environment, understanding those rules of hospitality, the extraordinary level of violence that suddenly takes place here makes this it's a insensible crime to us now. I think for the Cane Hill community at the time, it would have been almost impossible to comprehend.
Yes, and there was speculation at the time that part of the motive of the men, well, there was initial speculation that the massacring party were Indian, although that didn't really make much sense because Mr. Wright was basically the trader with all the Indians in the area.
Yes.
But there was speculation also at the time that there were people in the area that did not approve of him trading with the Indians, although obviously it was good business. And that may or may not have played a factor in the motivation, although in the end it appeared to be more purely monetary
and profit driven. But the idea of this, and again, I mean, I'm just wrapping my head around this crime now. The sense that Mr. Wright, obviously as an adult, was murdered almost instantaneously. His wife and eldest daughter flee in an attempt to get to the nearest neighbor to seek help, which is about a mile away, which also really speaks to the isolation of this region, this era at this time. And then the idea that the men who are there for money are not satisfied with going in, finding the money, and leaving. They go in with the intent to murder the children who are still in the house.
Yeah, and some of them were very small children.
Yes, an infant, a boy, a young boy, two girls, all murdered, very, very gruesomely. One young boy who was injured so badly that he suffered basically brain damage for the rest of his life. And then they set fire to the cabin, and there's still 3 children hiding in the cabin at the time who attempt to pull the bodies of their siblings out of the cabin as it is burning, and then are all discovered the next day. The bones of Mr. Wright and 3, 2 of his children and his infant child in the cabin. It is an absolutely horrific murder.
It really is, and but it also speaks to some of the issues that come up later in the Civil War when you talk about the Civil War in Arkansas and Indian Territory, because so much of it had to do with the various grudges, suspicions, and wariness between different parties, between the white settlers and different segments of the various Indian tribes. And it was a very complex situation. And I think it speaks to that in that later account. I mean, the original source materials are very clear what happened and who the parties were. But as time went on, and particularly when the history of Washington County was written, the Goodspeeds, which is usually a fairly reliable series of books, and it was written just after the Civil War. It ends up changing the story so that it reads that they are attacked and killed by Indians.
Yeah. The fact, and so, you know, we seem to have what appears to be a pretty clear cut details of this case. It did nothing really seems to be embellished, and it was our reference material is the Arkansas Historical Quarterly, volume 29, number 3, autumn of 1970. And that the information in that particular article was based on a contemporary reporting in the Arkansas Gazette, and that account, obviously I don't have a lot of point of comparison, a full disclaimer on that, but the account reads very solidly. There's outside of the crime itself, there doesn't appear to be a lot of emotional embellishment. Things just sort of proceed in terms of who's doing what and who confesses and who gets drunk and spills the beans.
Exactly. And in fact, confession of one brother against another, and one of the men was able to flee to southern Arkansas, and they tracked him down and brought him back and tried him a few months later. And again, that account again was very factual and not embellished, or and so it seems very clear who was involved, etc. But over time, the story gets changed in later accounts that are written 30 or 50 years later. They're different and embellished, and basically blaming the Indians for this. And you do have to wonder if part of that is because of just the lens of the Civil War at that point too,
which is certainly not impossible. And I think along with that, things like in various accounts after this contemporary retelling in the Arkansas Gazette, we see situations where there are additional characters. One character that may have been created entirely for dramatic purposes. A sexy seductress named Rompin' Ann, and then another that I found interesting in these further accounts, that the vigilante committee had severely beaten the accused, and the implication, which I think is potentially a very cheap implication, that the John Richmond, who was one of the men hanged for the crime, essentially confessed to the crime because he was being tortured.
Right. And you do see that in other similar circumstances being alluded to in other areas. There's a incident that happened in Jasper County, Missouri in 1854 that some of the accounts are written that would lead you to think that all the evidence was based on coerced confession, except for the fact that they were caught red-handed with blood, literally blood on their hands, and the money and items that were stolen.
Well, there is that.
There is that.
The perhaps unsatisfying reality of this, it appears that the individual who actually organized all the stuff, organized the crime itself, got away.
Yeah.
And it is implied got away with the money as well, escaping into Indian territory and never being seen in Cane Hill again.
Yeah. Which again may be part of how later it gets construed that Indians are involved, because between Mr. Wright's trading with the Indians and then him escaping to Indian territory, I just think that it gets mixed up in the retellings, which is also a good cautionary tale for when you're researching. You have to sift through and try to figure out what makes sense,
Yeah.
and what seems the most credible. And certainly in this case, the original newspaper accounts seem to be more credible.
They do. I find it particularly, to me anyway, particularly telling that the contemporary Arkansas Gazette reports from 1839 really have an impressive level of gravitas to them, in the sense that it appears just to be telling the series of the crime and process, and that
And enough details to make it credible too.
yes. Now there was a couple of things, and this is rapidly moving outside my realm of expertise, so I'm gonna, but perfectly suited for yours. But of course, this was not a regular courthouse judge jury case.
No, and often on the frontier at that time period, it wasn't.
Yes. And so there's, to me, again, I think counterpoint, one of the men ultimately hanged. I'm not going to say whether or not he was guilty, but he was ultimately hanged. Got drunk 10 to 15 days later and told on his brother that his brother had been involved in the murders. And these are all men who had initially been rounded up and arrested, provided alibis, and then they were released. Right. And so, despite the fact that we do not have a formal system in place, there seems to be a certain, certainly the giving a strong impression that this vigilante committee is not just looking for somebody to string up.
No, not just that. No, they go through a process. I mean, and well, in fact, the last one that they get, I mean, it's months later, and they go, it wasn't something that was just done. We rounded them up, the day after and lynched them that day either. So no, June 15th to July 29th. Yeah. So, which again seems awfully quick, but on the frontier, not necessarily. As opposed to the proverbial next night. Yeah, that's true. or literal next night. Something that really jumped out to me that was noted in the Arkansas Gazette in their trial, that certainly it's a word that we've been hearing a lot lately on social media, objection hearsay, but that hearsay was admissible in this. Of course, this is not my area of expertise. So what do you feel about just this Arkansas Gazette report in that regard? Well, okay, I guess, first of all, for people to understand, hearsay evidence is something you are testifying to, something that you don't have firsthand knowledge on. You are relying on someone else's statements or, reading it somewhere, that kind of thing. But typically it's, John told me that Tom killed him, or John told me, this happened. But you weren't there at the time, so you didn't witness it. There are certain exceptions that are admissible anyway, and it's kind of complicated. And there was not enough detail in the article to know it, to say, okay, that in particular could have been an exception that might get in now or not. But you always do worry that hearsay evidence can lead to a wrong result. One good example that people often do, they'll tell their attorney, people like me, Tom saw the whole thing, but he can't be here. He can't come to court. He's in California now, but he can write a letter. Well, you can't take that as evidence because you can't cross-examine it.
Right.
That's the problem with it is, okay, Tom writes this down, but if there's any question, you can't cross-examine it to evaluate its credibility or whether it's, in fact true. So, and a lot of people, they don't get that. Well, if they sign a notarized statement, that should be good enough. Not as evidence in court.
Right. Now, I do find just the expediency of the frontier to be very interesting, and also taking into account the really the sparsity of anyone to ask. This is a very small community of individuals, and so I think you're just that dynamic that essentially I would hazard a guess to say that within the Cane Hill community, everybody knew each other.
I'm sure, because it was very small, and in those situations on the frontier, it often was something that really was done hastily, and a group of men that were pretty well respected in the community would a judge basically work as a grand jury or an inquest and make a decision. And even a little later, when you had more organized courts, they would be circuit courts, and we still, like in Missouri, we still call our courts circuit courts. And circuit, for a lot of circuits in Missouri, it's one county, but there are some that there's 4 or 5 counties in that circuit. And back in the 1800s, if you had a circuit, it may be several counties, and there were a lot fewer counties, so that in Southwest Missouri, the area that say about 12 or 13 counties cover now, were about 3 counties. Back, they've been divided. And so you would have a judge who you'd have courthouses around, and he literally, the reason we call them circuit courts is he would ride the circuit. He would ride from courthouse to courthouse. And so you may not see a judge for 2 or 3 months. And so everything that happens in that time, he gets to deal with when he gets there. And there were cases when people decided they weren't going to wait.
Yeah. And in some cases, very pragmatically so. That's
some yes, and some not.
and some really not. I find it interesting. And again, I think dealing with these points of mutual contradiction, that if you understand the pragmatism underneath it, everything begins to make sense. You realize that these decisions weren't made because these people were so incredibly different than we are today. What we don't necessarily understand is the utilitarian realities of their lives within that structure. And once you understand that, the decisions really start making sense. And then the reality that certainly the Old West and the motif of the Great American West, which started here, you could argue it started further east as well, but I largely think of the motif of our concept of the Great American West beginning just west of the Mississippi. Although granted, the original Great American Northwest was Ohio.
True.
That's another story. But it has been translated and retranslated so many times in pop culture, and so the concept of the vigilante mob, the townspeople ready to hang someone, these types of things, these themes and these ideas, they are not precisely untrue, but they are very acontextual.
Very true. That's very true. And often dramatized in certain ways in pop culture, particularly film and so forth, for effect that don't generally fit the reality.
No, and I think rarely do. But of course, that's the power of drama.
That's true. Makes a good movie.
And we all like good movies. Speaking of good movies, we had a war.
Yes, we did.
a really large war in the 1860s. And approximately speaking, 3 theaters. So we were discussing this on YouTube. Encourage people to check out Dark Ozarks on YouTube. Like, share, and subscribe. Click the notification bell. All those things that people say to do. And that there was essentially an Eastern theater and a Western theater. Mm-hmm. And if you're unfamiliar with your geography at the time, you would conclude that we, being the furthest west here in the Ozarks, would be the Western theater, and you would be wrong. Yeah. Because the Western theater's westernmost border was the Mississippi River, which means we were west of the Western theater. Yeah. And that was affectionately referred to and strategically referred to as the Trans-Mississippi.
Yes. Yes, just don't try to use compass points to describe it.
No. So, at various times, really started 1862 to 1864, a number of Confederate troops and Union troops would be moved east to the Western theater.
Yeah.
Particularly in regards to Vicksburg and the siege thereof.
Yes, from both sides, and it certainly affected what happened in the Trans-Mississippi.
It did, and obviously, and things that happened in Missouri impacted what happened in Arkansas. Things happening in Arkansas impacted what was happening in Missouri. Missouri was a divided state, in every sense of the word. So many of the things that were happening nationally and macro were happening state level and county level and micro here in the state of Missouri. And realistically, things weren't a whole lot better in Arkansas. This is not an easy, Arkansas did not have an easy time of it any more than Missourians did. And something that is particularly notable, and of course, it also, again, microcosm or smaller scale. I mean, if you've got 2,000 dead, that's not a small scale, but right. in comparison to some other things happening out east, smaller scale, but in a comparatively short time, it really became evident that the North's industrial strength was going to overwhelm the Confederacy.
Yes, and commands on both sides started realizing that much sooner than it was ever intimated in any other way, to further out, and that's why you start having these odd shifting of resources trying to deal with that, particularly on the Confederate side, because they were juggling basically. Trying to keep as many balls in the air as long as they could,
and hope for some sort of intervention.
They definitely were. They were hoping that Britain would intervene.
Yes,
Britain was courting the South because we're cotton, but they never did intervene. And then by the time the war was over, they had discovered cotton in India. So suddenly the South wasn't as important, and that became a big issue in Reconstruction. But
suddenly decided to shop at somebody else's Walmart Supercenter.
Yeah, pretty much. Because they bought it, basically.
Yeah.
Euphemism there. I'm I'm joking. Yeah, because they took India.
We bought the nation. I'm sure they won't mind, and if they do, they don't care. Yeah, that of course is a whole nother issue, but it which I'll keep my mouth shut. Lots of coffee. So the thing that, and of course there are heroes and villains on all sides of this story, and there are so many individuals, idealistic, pragmatic, in individuals who are just literally and figuratively caught in the crossfire. One of the most heartbreaking aspects, and I think we'll get into this, but to me, the war really becomes real in situations like the Elkhorn Tavern or the Borden House, when literally a family whose only crime to suddenly find themselves in a war zone is that they got up that morning in their house.
Yeah, and I've been there. I've been there.
Yes, I'm really excited. We're gonna conclude talking about your investigation at Prairie Grove Cemetery, or Prairie Grove Battlefield, and I'm super excited. I've not actually been there,
so we'll have to get you there.
I'm looking forward to it. After reading, there's a number of things I want to share, but a consistency to me. There's several consistencies of what the Confederacy dealt with in Arkansas through the majority of the war, basically after 1861. Summer fall of 1861 was a high point, and there never really was a high point after that.
No.
March of 1862, the Union clearly won the Battle of Pea Ridge in northwest Arkansas, just across the Missouri state line. And then it is just a series of supply chain issues, delaying tactics, and attempts to intercede, or attempts to attack that either don't come to fruition, are blunted, or are quite frankly various levels of disaster.
Yeah.
That said, something that consistently stands out is that there's a handful of names, like Joe Shelby, whose bravery
and smoke and mirrors,
who really rise to the level of legend. Names, I'm just going to throw out some names and give a little bit of sort of my peripheral opinion, and then I really want yours on this. Robert E. Lee, Jeb Stuart, Joe Shelby. Something that, from my vantage point, as it appears, we have a number of great heroes for the Union, great American heroes. I would lean toward putting one of my favorites, Ulysses S. Grant, in this list as well. That said, there is something about the overall sort of perspective, concept, I would say, and just overall management and movement of the Union armies that suggests this industrial behemoth just slowly coming to life, churning out mass formations, and inexorably reaching its end. And the questions of strategy and tactics had a lot more to do with not if the Union would win, but simply when. And bad strategy could delay the wars, but it wasn't going to, prevent it from coming to an end with a Union victory. in sort of a monolithic grinding of war is hell, we're here to do our job, we're just moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
On the Confederate side, we have these personalities that are larger than life personalities that
Mm-hmm.
capture the imagination, and I think fuel an emotional response that is much different.
Yes, very, very much so. I mean, yeah. I mean, there are some on the Union side that have that personality, and Grant definitely is one, especially in retrospect. But you do have these characters, that officers for the Confederacy, which all the ones you've mentioned, of course, were federal officers. I mean, they'd all been Army officers before the war, and then when war broke out, elected to go with the Confederacy and leave their commissions.
Yes.
And so I think sometimes people kind of forget that most of these guys, it's not like they woke up and suddenly said, I'm a soldier, I'm a general, and hi Confederacy, I'm here.
Yes.
They've been in the Army for years.
Yeah.
And so actually some of the very most talented officers in the Union Army suddenly were on the other side. And that is, to their credit, a big piece of the puzzle of how the Confederacy lasted as long as they did was the talent of people like Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart, and our direction, people like Joe Shelby, who probably, if he had been operating in the East, would be a lot more known now than he is.
Yes, and I'm teaser. We're going to get into Shelby a lot soon, and I'm
yes,
very very excited about that. Something that really a level of gallantry, a level of bravery, coming to Battle of Cane Hill, immediately the Battle of Prairie Grove, situations that we see over and over, and we saw this with the Second Battle of Newtonia in October of 1864, right?
Mm-hmm.
October 30th, and that higher ups and larger command decisions and larger decisions of things like simply not having enough supplies, all of these things that Joe Shelby had no control over, and suddenly he's the one commanding on the front line with his cavalry, and then essentially creating these brilliant tactics of delaying action, allowing the his commanding officers and the remainder of the army to escape or to transition out of harm's way or away from Union forces unscathed in these really brilliant maneuvers that it's phenomenal, especially when you put yourself into the place that these guys aren't playing games.
No.
This is for real.
Yes, and Shelby was a sort of force of nature, by all accounts of people who knew him before the war, during the war, and after the war, just for people to kind of understand that one person can kind of affect things like this and have such an effect. My favorite Joe Shelby story is still the Gallatin trial of the Cass County county officials for embezzling the bonds right after the Civil War, and they were traveling by train to Gallatin because it was safer for the trial. And Shelby is on the train because he's on the train for business, because he's representing one of the railroads, not in that case, but so he's just there. and a mob decides to attack the train and drag the defendants off, and kill them. And as they do so, someone recognizes him and yells, "Joe Shelby's in here." And people are yelling, get him, and they get to the door, and while everyone has run, he's just sitting in his chair, and he goes, "If you want me, come and get me." And they ended up turning around and leaving without him pulling a gun.
It it is the quintessential Western gunman,
Mm-hmm.
but for real.
But for real, yeah.
And
but to have that kind of sort of effect, just through your personality,
yes,
is not something that you see very often.
it is not. And I think force of nature, one in a generation, perhaps one of only a multiple generations, would be the man that was Joe Shelby. Jumping into a little bit more of the micro for a moment, something I found really interesting. I want to pick your brain on this. There are a lot of very indeterminate ghost stories associated with War Eagle Mill.
Yeah.
I find this particularly interesting. Everybody seems to say that they're, speaking of hearsay, everybody seems to have an opinion that someone has a ghost story about War Eagle, but it seems very difficult to pin it down to a person who has a ghost story about War Eagle. That said, War Eagle Mill is one of my favorite places to visit in the great state of Arkansas.
It is. It's neat. It really is. It really is.
And the most terrifying photo of a cottonmouth on State of the Ozarks is taken at War Eagle. Not by me, because I'm scared of cottonmouths.
As most people should be.
He was a grumpy snake. And I love this in terms of putting the notes together. I got to put two of my most favorite words together. Two words in the English language that I love putting together, and that is bean palace.
Okay.
Because the restaurant at War Eagle is called the Bean Palace.
Oh yeah.
On the third floor. So I wrote the Bean Palace. Shout out, well, amazing food, the possibility of ghosts. It's on the third floor. I was there in November. I did not see any ghosts, but I did get the food. And they have some of the best black beans or brown beans that you're ever going to get. You just
I have not eaten in a restaurant, so I can't say.
Yeah, I highly approve. And what I love about the restaurant at War Eagle is it is quintessentially Boston Mountains, Northwest Arkansas traditional.
Yeah, definitely is.
You're not going to find anything fancy. You're going to find stuff that's real, and it's real good.
And the accounts I generally have heard from ghosts there are sort of the, I hate to use the word more generic, but more vague, witnessing a soldier, but not a lot of details, not a lot of particular action going on or anything, but just observing someone that looks like they're in Civil War uniform type thing.
Yes, and again, I tend to concur. The stuff that we get, no one seems to have really defined it, other than some possible poltergeist activity that is, as far as I can tell, loosely attributed to the mill's original builder, Sylvanus Blackburn.
Yeah.
Or
sense.
It does, or a Confederate soldier, or several Confederate soldiers. I found it interesting that one of the references suggest that it might have been that one of the Confederate ghosts might have been a casualty from Pea Ridge. Now, to me, that is a bit of a stretch.
I would think so.
It's a bit of a stretch, considering the distance between Pea Ridge and War Eagle. That said, Confederate armies did cross the War Eagle Bridge after the defeat after their defeat at the Battle of Pea Ridge. But there's lots and lots. To me, trying to make that connection is very tenuous, because it speaks to the fact that nobody's willing to really dig into the fact that there's an enormous amount of Civil War history that is directly associated with that immediate region, and they just want to tie it to a battle that is honestly quite some distance away.
Right, and I think that's one thing that kind of tends to happen in this region, because people will often say, and I've had people come to me over the years with saying, you know, we see the Civil War soldier on our land, but it doesn't make any sense because nothing happened there.
But you have no idea.
Exactly. That's the thing, is you really don't. One lady over by Reed's told me a story some years ago that they have a farm, and she was standing at the kitchen sink doing dishes and had a window over the sink and was looking out. And occasionally she would see what looked like someone walking through the field across the road. And at times they were close enough that it looked like a soldier, Civil War uniform. And this happened several times. And then she said, one day she's doing dishes and she sees him walking, and he stops and turns towards the house and waves and then walks on. And that's when it kind of freaked her out. And but the problem is so many things happen that, you know, in small skirmishes, etc., and a lot of things not really documented well, that it's very hard to say at any particular place in this region nothing happened in the Civil War.
It really is. And you know, that reminds me of actually something that I was just thinking about this morning, putting notes together, that down by Bull Shoals Dam and the Bull Shoals, Arkansas, is the original Mountain Village 1890, which has a number of historical buildings that were moved into that location. Some of them quite old. Many of them are reported to be haunted. And one of the structures that was moved in was the original Civil War era church from Blue Eye. And the story that I was told with that was that during the war, the citizens of Blue Eye, so for people who are not familiar, Blue Eye, Missouri is split down the middle with the state line. The half of the town is in Arkansas, half of the town is in Missouri. And that the citizens of the town would, on a daily basis, seek refuge in nearby caves and then emerge wondering whether or not they were going to have their houses burned down. And, you know, we can tell that in retrospect and be like, oh, wow, that's so sad. Put yourself in that place.
Exactly. And just the kind of emotion that gets imprinted in an area because of that. Yes.
And resonances. This is an Arkansas ghost story, so I'll share it. It is at Mountain Village 1890, near Bull Shoals, just basically in Bull Shoals, actually. But group, this was told to me. I wasn't on the group. Group was taking an evening tour. They had gone into the church, and then they start walking out of the church, and there's a woman in white just at the edge of the light, standing next to the trees, looks at them and basically disappears into the dark. and she was wearing period dress. And the individual I was talking to, who I was working with, he saw her. He was one of the individuals who had seen her. I find the location. I've only been there once. I was doing some recording and some filming with basically in near pitch darkness by the time we got done. Very few people, almost no, basically. And I'm gadding about, trying to, pick my way through the area around these really old buildings. It's really hot. It was July, early August, really dark. And I'm going, this place is haunted, but it feels very comfortable.
There you go.
Yeah. So I'm assuming they liked me. It certainly, and again, the sense that I got, which oftentimes is as good as I get, with that, was just the fact that they felt at home. They were comfortable. And I'm going to reference Kendrick House, but there was a very, thinking back on it, there was a similarity of resonance as with Kendrick House, in the sense that we grew up with hospitality and we're not going to stop.
There you go. Yeah, and that does fit. That does fit. We were talking about a lot of these ghost stories from the war, tend to be kind of vague or whatever, like at War Eagle. A counterpoint would be at Cabin Creek. I love the ghost story there.
Yes.
That specifically, that a man, a bearded man in a threadbare gray military coat, tips his tricorner hat at lady cleaning the brush in the cemetery.
Yes.
And which of course seems a little odd, because that would be a Revolutionary era hat, except for General Richard Gano, who died there, was known to wear one.
And we have photographic evidence of him doing so.
Yes, there's photographs of him wearing the tricorner. And so, so there you have one that you feel fairly confident to say that's likely him. But that's kind of an exception, really, with a lot of stories.
It is. We do have that, though, and I love the ghost stories that move beyond the vague, might have seen something, Confederate soldier walking in a distance, that sort of thing. And when there actually begins to be interaction, which we do have some really interesting documentation on. Steve Cottrell got some really interesting stuff. Yeah.
And Steve Cottrell, who's a friend of ours, one of his books is Haunted Ozarks Battlefields, and anyone that's interested ought to get that book if you can find it. It's I don't know if it's still in print, but it tells a lot of stories that have come out of people who are reenacting and people who are at these locations a lot. So,
and it's very well written. It's very very accessible, but very precise. Of course, that's where General Richard Gano's Cabin Creek reference comes from. There was some interesting ones. A gunsmith at Silver Dollar City. This was a number of years ago. Gunsmith at Silver Dollar City, telling of a 3-year-old girl whose family visited Pea Ridge National Battlefield, and partway through she just starts screaming in terror because she can hear the battle. Yeah, that no one else can.
And I really don't have any. I mean, it's always easy to say, a child's exaggerating or just play acting or something. A 3-year-old that's describing battle noises in detail, usually they're not going to be able to do that. Plus, in my experience investigating, kids often do have experiences that adults around them don't. And auditory and visual experiences are not that unusual, and kids have a wider field of hearing. So if there were noises that were just beyond normal adult hearing range, she certainly could have been hearing something, literally.
Yes.
No one else hearing.
And this this is something that it seems very consistent with this whole process, is that these battles in history have a time, date, place.
Mm-hmm.
They have a beginning, middle, and end, and we have the troop movements and the artillery barrages, and all of these things are encapsulated in that moment. And yet, time after time after time, we get reports that on some level they're continuing. Hello?
Hello.
Hey.
We had a strange event. My phone powered off,
Oh my.
even
Okay.
though it had battery.
Wow. Okay.
So we shall continue.
Sounds good. We'll do part 2.
Actually, I don't think it stopped recording.
Oh, good.
So
All righty. We're back.
we're back. So I maybe something didn't want us talking about what we were talking about. I don't know. Okay. So where were we?
Oh my gosh. So the battlefield, the sense that battlefields seem to just continue to fight the battle.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. You get that in various places.
It's eerie because you don't know, like, is this some sort of magnetic resonance in multiple planes, or are these poor people stuck in a loop where they have to relive their deaths?
To me, I don't think most of them are stuck. I think a lot of times with battlefield kind of activity, it's you get a lot of residual activity that's just sounds and images replaying, just like a silent film. But you do get interactive things like General Gano tipping his hat, and when I came in the other room, I forgot my notes, but I think it was at the cemetery at Van Buren? Is it Van Buren, where the soldier motions to the tombstones when asked why he's here?
Yes.
And I think there's a lot to that they have such a connection to that place and to the other people who were there. You know, the bonds between the men fighting were so strong that you know, I think they often are there willingly because of that.
I tend to agree, and that's actually from Bud Steed's book.
Yeah. Was it? Yeah.
With in the History Press Haunted America series,
Mm-hmm.
and some really interesting things. Particularly interesting to me because a number of these places I've been to, one of them being the National Cemetery in Fayetteville.
Yeah.
And I've been there.
Mm-hmm.
It was during the day, and I didn't see anything cool other than I did find Vance Randolph's grave, which is
That's
why
cool.
we were there. But essentially, there's reports of spook lights in the
Mm-hmm.
in the space that sound very similar to our spook light, the Joplin spook light.
Well, often and traditionally, spook lights are often seen in cemeteries, and I've seen one in Peace Church Cemetery, going through the trees on the east side of the cemetery. Fairly large and bluish white. So I can say I've seen that kind of thing at a cemetery.
Yes. One of the things that double check here, actually at the Massard and Massard Prairie battlefield near Fort Smith, a lot of paranormal reports, but one of them being that of the apparition of a Union soldier looking through the living room window.
Yeah.
Apparently watching TV.
Oh boy, what in the world? What kind of sorcery is this?
As you do start stepping into what I tend to classify it again, sounds like a contradiction in terms of the normalization of the paranormal.
Yeah.
The idea that it is not out of the realm of certainly our reasoning and normality that a ghost could choose to stay. would the apparition appears as much as they did when they died, still in uniform, etc., but with sentience and activity, and not a sense of malevolence whatsoever.
No.
And in many cases, I think we see this not necessarily to this level that Bud Steed recorded, but a level of curiosity about this new world that they're semi-interacting with.
Well, and I think that's fair. I mean, I think that's very fair. I think that anyone that gets a glimpse of something very unusual, has that curiosity. Well, the Space Link launches right now that go on periodically.
Yes.
Are a good example, and the aerial phenomena associated with it is interesting, and there was one over the house not long ago. But people are just so fascinated and come up with all kinds of stories about it. And I mean, if you're from that time period and suddenly see something that would be so much different, I'd be curious too.
I know. I mean, you would. It does make me wonder what was on TV and what his favorite show is.
Hopefully not Baywatch. The pinnacle of our culture, right?
I'm not going to say what I just thought. So I'll leave that to the imagination of our audience. But a story also recorded by Bud Steed that definitely recommend getting his works. He's also an excellent writer.
He is.
Very, very accessible in his writing, and very on the ground, which I really, really love. A Van Buren story. And of course, there's the Battle of Van Buren, of a family that encounters a Civil War soldier in their modern hotel room.
Yes, that's one of my favorites. That I think it's the mother wakes up in the middle of the night and looks over, and Civil War soldier is staying at the end of the other bed where their kids are sleeping, and
Yes.
she jumps and shrieks and wakes her husband up, and he sees what he thinks is a man in the room and basically tackles him and goes straight through him.
Yes. and then as they came to, and then we're describing it, it was a fairly tall man with long stringy hair that poked out from underneath a dilapidated hat, a full unkempt beard, and a pistol tucked into the front of a wide belt, and he wore Confederate gray. And he's in a modern building.
Yeah, he's in the the Motel 6 or whatever, the Days Inn or whatever.
Yeah. And that, I think a couple of things, and this is something that you've referenced often, that I think people have a hard time wrapping their heads around. There are many reasons that paranormal activity takes place, and there's nothing that says that paranormal activity has to take place in a location that we're told looks spooky, or we culturally recognize as looking old and spooky.
That's very true. Actually, I get more stories and people reaching out for help from restaurants, gas stations, things like that, you just don't think about, well, why is there activity there? But, your Casey's or your Come and Go could be haunted,
Right.
Your Arby's or Hardee's or whatever, and often they are.
And sometimes very, very dramatically.
Yes.
In terms of activity.
Yes.
Do you see it as either one or the other, or a combination thereof? I'm just curious. A situation where an occurrence happened on that physical location. Obviously, modernity plants something else on top of it, as being more often, or a situation in which something nearby happened, but as opposed to, again, pop culture and legend, ghosts, paranormal energy is not necessarily tied to a singular location. They can move around like we can, sometimes
exactly.
better.
I think often it's something that happened just in the area, and maybe not 100 years ago, could have been a year ago or whatever. I know of a fast food restaurant that is haunted to the point that they moved a booth out and moved the drink machine into that space because they kept having activity in that booth, and they know what happened. They had a customer who died in the booth, died of a heart attack.
Yeah.
So,
and that's things that I can, individuals can be understandably reticent about sharing those types of things. That's not in the commercially viable tourist haunting category.
Very true.
There's not a lot of romance and romantic tragedy that can be marketed by, realistically, I see myself haunting the candy aisle at a Walmart Supercenter, so that's less than romantic as well.
Grocery stores too. I've had a number of stories from grocery stores, by the way, now that you say that.
There's people there, and there have been. I think that's fascinating, and I really, really do this. Of course, we encourage people, and throw this in real quick before we get to our conclusions, but we just encourage people to share, comment. You can privately message us if you need somebody to talk to about this sort of thing, but you don't want it to be public. We're more than happy to do that as well.
Yes. Because we're very interested in preserving stories and but also privacy when necessary.
When necessary or requested. It's just to me, this can be a really beautiful and amazing community. I know that, like all genres of communities, it can be rife with conflict, but to such a large degree, I think the interplay between those who've gone on before and those who are currently here can be a very peaceful, a very positive, a very constructive thing.
It really can. It really, really can.
Now, that said, there's a location I really want to visit with you about. This possibly would be our conclusion. Battle of Prairie Grove, Arkansas, battlefield originally took place in December 7th, 1862. This is still very early in the war. The war began in 1861. This is only the end of 1862, so maybe midpoint, really. But earlier in March, Battle of Pea Ridge took place that largely secured Union control or Union military control of northwest Arkansas. And Battle of Prairie Grove was pretty much finished off Confederate strategic control in the region.
Right.
It had a lot of violent moving parts, a lot of troop movement, a lot of troops engaged. It was December, it was cold, it was snowy, it was very uncomfortable. We have really what is a heroic march by two Union divisions from Springfield who showed up gallantly in record time, surprising the Confederate forces under General Thomas Hindman, who is a bit of a interesting and troubled figure in and of himself. And then we've got a number of locations, something that compared it, so something that really struck out to me just in terms of bringing this entire process home. Comparatively speaking, casualty deaths were comparatively low, but the Confederates had to leave the field, essentially had to retreat rather rapidly, leaving their dead in piles, and then having placed makeshift barriers to keep the pigs from eating the corpses.
Yeah.
It's pretty dark.
Yeah. It is. I mean, it is a dark episode, and some of the families they're all huddled in a cellar, and I forget the name of the home. The Borden family went to a neighbor's home. There was a neighbor's cellar that there were 20-some people huddled in this small dirt cellar, and they were in there pretty much all day and stayed in there most of the night until they were pretty sure it was safe. And the accounts of the civilians later were just reminiscent of accounts from World War II of people taking shelter in the bombings and so forth, and hearing the cannon fire and hearing yelling and so on and so forth, and not really having a way to know if it really was safe to come out. And really just writing about, the psychological impact it had on them. And I think it's just sort of indicative of just how things affected people. Several years ago, I was able to do an investigation there. And we investigated at night with permission of the park rangers. And we had a couple things happen that were pretty interesting. They have a lot of the buildings preserved the way they were. There are cannons set up where there were artillery on the field. And going on about 11 o'clock that night, you started hearing phantom cannon fire. And we actually had a ranger with us, and they were verifying there's no recordings, there's nothing that plays anything in the park or anything like that could be triggered to hear that. So actually the park ranger was a little disconcerted. But if you've ever been around in reenactment, hear the cannons. I mean, it's a very distinctive sound. You know what you're hearing, and so that was very interesting. But the thing that was the most interesting to me, we were walking along a path, and this again, it's actually after that. It's probably close to midnight. There was some moonlight, but it's dark. And there's a gravel path, and there's about 4 of us walking, and we start hearing footsteps off to our right. And, we stop, first the thought is it a deer or something? When we stop, the footsteps stop. We start walking, they start walking. And it becomes apparent it's bipedal. So we end up stopping in a spot that's even more shadowy than the rest of the path. And we just stand there and turn around facing where we came from and see a shadow. It looks like a shadow of a man walk across the path on into the brush on the other side. And then you hear steps going that direction.
Yeah. I really want to get down there.
Yeah, it's neat. Yeah.
So a specific location, we've already mentioned it, but the Borden House. Of course, the original house was burned during the battle. It was a significant location during the battle, also why it was burned. The Bordens immediately rebuilt the home and the same design, the same floor plan, basically created an identical home in its place. It was by 1976, it had been largely reclaimed by nature. And falling into ruins. It has been rebuilt. It was featured in The Blue and the Gray in 1982. It was nearly blown up by accident.
Yeah.
In the filming, and but has been restored back to its original glory. It's been featured in paintings. Obviously, there's some great photography of the structure. Did you all get to interact with the house while you were there?
They had it closed off at that time. I mean, we were around it up on the porch and so forth, but it was closed. The building itself was closed, so you couldn't go in it.
I find that location very fascinating, and it is an incredibly beautiful home.
It is. It's very beautiful. It's very it's very picturesque setting. Actually feels very calm. When we were there, it was very calm. You just felt like sitting down on the porch and staying.
Yeah. Oh, I think this, the investigation and findings, I think, for Prairie Grove is probably the conclusive point of really our discussion. We have lots more that we can go into, and we will, in the future episodes. That said, I want to throw this out as possibly a concluding conversation.
Okay.
For individuals who would be interested in trying out their own investigations. Obviously, you all conducted an investigation at Prairie Grove. We just conducted an investigation in Alton at Mineral Springs Hotel. What would you tell people or advise people to do if they were wanting to get into this kind of thing?
To start, I always advise try to find someone or a group that has experience, so that you can get advice, get expertise, and I don't use that expertise in the sense of there's any experts in the paranormal, but as far as ways of approaching an investigation. And more than one, because people do it different ways and different things work for different people. I'm not going to say that my way is the only way by any stretch of the imagination. It just works for me.
Yeah.
But like anything else, you don't go mountain climbing without a little preparation. And that's the way I look at these things.
Yeah.
And a lot of people will kind of just run headlong into it, and then not have a good experience that might not have gone that way if they'd gotten some advice and observation of other people doing this. And research, some people, they want to go in and not know anything about a location, which I think is okay once you have experience under your belt.
Mm-hmm.
But getting started, I think to filter through what you may experience, knowing what happens somewhere is important, because like anything else, as you do this, you get better at filtering through things that happen.
Yes.
And interpreting it and being, objective of, oh, no, that was something else, or this could be paranormal,
Yes, very, very true. I think that's great advice. Of course, you all have been kind enough to begin shepherding me in the process. So I appreciate it. I'm the journalist newbie that's, coming along going and doing my best.
I wouldn't say, new at this point, but
we have done some stuff. I'm very happy about that.
Yeah, I think you're hooked.
It's a lot of fun. When it's done respectfully.
Yeah.
It can also, I think, my 2 cents worth on this is you really have to love the process. It's not an issue of seeking. It should not be about thrill seeking.
No, not at all. And I'll be the first one to say that if you're going to do it just to be urban exploring, you don't need to be doing it.
No, always get permission.
Yes.
Interact with the human, the living, interact with individuals, conduct yourself well, do not trespass, all of those, not fun adult things that lead you to being able to go back to locations over and over, and that's how you gather evidence.
Exactly. Because you can burn bridges and lose your credibility, and also create a situation where no one else is going to be able to go there either. So.
Right. And I think, if we can sort of do our best to use this platform to encourage the next generation of investigators to conduct themselves with gravitas and professionality, it's going to be better for all of us, not just us, not just you guys, whomever you are, but everybody, because it opens doors when you act like you ought to.
Exactly.
I was trying to find out like a really gentle diplomatic way of saying that, but it's all I got tonight.
Sometimes you just have to say it.
Act like you ought to, folks.
That's right.
And you'll get invited back.
Exactly. As my grandmother used to say, don't act like you were born in a barn.
I used to read stories to my goats. I took
But you
my
weren't
love of
born in the
literature to the
barn.
barn. What's that, Lisa?
I said, but you weren't born in the barn.
No, I was not. I was not. I had a reasonable sense of decorum from a young age. Oh, we're devolving. I'm devolving. You're doing just fine.
I don't know about that. But we lost our producer.
All right. Well, that happens too. It's one of those nights.
So I'm no idea what we're doing here. But we lost our producer.
Back to story time.
That's the story time.
Flag down Alex and Confederate. We mentioned the National Cemetery in Fayetteville,
Yes.
Arkansas. There's also the Confederate Cemetery in Fayetteville. I've been to both, and I would. They have the cemetery has hours. It's I think until 10 p.m. or something like that, or until
something like that. Yeah.
Which I, of course, want people to respect, and I want to respect. I will respect as well. It would be very interesting just to do even a daytime investigation there. I've been there twice now, and there's a large portion of semi-reclaimed cemetery that is unmarked.
Yeah.
That I am particularly fascinated with. I don't think it's necessarily that portion is not necessarily Confederate cemetery. I think it predates the Confederate cemetery. It's a beautiful location. You can see much of downtown Fayetteville from the hill, but it's still surrounded by woods. And there is I believe that there's something there. I think there's a lot of something there besides just the deer, but there's a lot of deer. And it's a residential area. There's folks' homes right across the street. But it is very evocative, and it feels like it wants to tell me something, but I'm not good enough to know what it is it wants to say yet.
But there is a pretty famous ghost story there.
Yes, the Burning Bride, classic ghost story, which does seem to have some. I think we could safely say it's a folkloric ghost story, but it does seem to have a measure of truth to it.
Yeah,
and it is rather chilling. One of the prominent fathers of Fayetteville in the early settler years had built his home in that immediate area, and this is just off from the downtown square. If you don't mind the hills, you could easily walk to the square from this immediate space. And his bride, his daughter was getting married. He ordered the most expensive dress that he could get, had it shipped in. It was made of Venetian lace, meaning in that era it was made in Venice, Italy. And yet, of course, they were, and this seems like a contradiction, but I think when you start wrapping your head around this combination of early settlement, pioneering spirit, and wealth of the natural resources that is suddenly bringing people a lot of money, it actually does make sense that we have individuals who are accustomed to living in log cabins, tending large hearth fires, essentially living the pioneer life, and yet having enough money that you can mail order a wedding dress from Venice.
It's kind of hard to imagine now. It
is, but it's, I think that, people have to realize that the part of the draw of the American dream of the settlement of that era was also wealth.
Yeah.
And, obviously having land of your own or a homestead of your own or personal autonomy, those are realities too. But people were moving westward because the natural resources meant they could get extraordinarily wealthy in very comparatively very short periods of time. And so we had this girl who's gotten married, that she's accustomed to wearing cotton. And the basic gist, you guys probably know where I'm going with this. The basic gist is that if your cotton dress, the hem of your cotton dress catches on fire on the hearth, you just pat it out.
Right.
And so, not thinking, she's still wearing her Venetian wedding dress on the night of her wedding, which makes this excessively tragic, and goes to tend the hearth fire. The lace catches fire. She just goes to pat it out, and the layers of Venetian lace essentially ignite,
Right.
and she catches completely on fire, runs screaming into the forest in the immediate region of the Fayetteville Confederate Cemetery, and sets the forest on fire as well, and of course dies. And then that her ghost then is reported to be seen to be associated with the holler, with the ridge, with the area, and things from out of the corner of your eye, you think you see fire. Hearing screams in the night, these sorts of things. It's very tragic.
It really is. Just everything going right and wrong at the same time.
Yes, and of course we'll talk about this later in the season, but one of the just the importance of not tempting fate at great thresholds. And of course, in the traditional sense, weddings were great thresholds, still are, sort of. And of course, then the last thing that, just so y'all know, the last thing that you do is tempt fate twice, which is have your threshold space, your wedding, happening during a threshold space, that threshold space being the solstice,
right?
And specifically the winter solstice. So the most unlucky thing to do is to schedule your wedding for Christmas.
Exactly. And on that note,
yes,
I think we can wind up there.
Sounds good.
And thank you, everyone, and we will see you next Wednesday.
Sounds good. Thank you all. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Josh. Thanks, everyone.